Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webcast titled The Pretreatment 101 Series, Industrial User Wastewater Survey Procedures. This webcast is sponsored by EPA's Office of Water. I am Jan Pickrell, EPA's National Pretreatment Program Coordinator in the Water Permits Division of the Office of Wastewater Management, or otherwise known as OWM, and I will moderate today's session. Thank you all for joining us today. We'll start by going over a few housekeeping items. The materials in this webcast have been reviewed by EPA staff for technical accuracy. Mention of any commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean that EPA endorses them. I would like to welcome everyone to this webcast. This is the first in a series of pretreatment program webcasts that will discuss the federally required implementation procedures of a pretreatment program as required by 40 CFR Part 403, as well as other National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES, permit requirements. I would like to briefly summarize some of the features of this webcast system. If you have any technical difficulties, you can call 1-800-833-2812 or click the Help button on your computer to receive technical support from ON24. If you are calling internationally, please call 1-415-829-5211. The event number for this webcast is 218566. Please use this number when requesting assistance so that the ON24 staff will know which webcast you are watching. You may also use the Ask a Question area to post any technical issues you are experiencing. Please include a telephone number where you can be reached, and we will help you troubleshoot your problem. We will have several question and answer sessions during this webcast. To ask a question, simply type your question in the text box located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Then click on the Submit Question button. You don't need to wait until the question and answer periods to submit your questions. In fact, we highly encourage you to please submit your questions early in the presentations. There will be several occasions when we will ask you questions. These poll questions will appear in the slide window. Please submit your answers in that same slide window, not in the Ask a Question box. If you would like to see closed captioning, just click on the closed captioning button on the lower left corner of your screen. Then, at the end of our webcast, you will be asked to complete an evaluation survey. This webcast will be archived indefinitely, so you can access it in a few weeks. The archive webcast will be posted on EPA's website at www.epa.gov/NPDES/training. We will let you know when it becomes accessible. One final note before we start. We will try to answer as many questions as possible throughout this webcast. However, due to the number of participants, not all questions will be answered. We have posted the speaker's contact information in case you would like to contact them after the webcast, and we can also create a question and answer document that will also be accessible. Okay. This webcast is the first in our series of pretreatment program training webcasts. The pretreatment program and pretreatment program regulations are focused on the regulation of industries or non-domestic users that discharge to a publicly owned treatment works or POTW, and the regulations and procedures required of those POTWs in order to protect their municipal facility from harm. As stated before, this is the first in our series where we will introduce the topic of identifying those non-domestic users to the POTW system. Additional webcasts will address the other fundamentals of the pretreatment program, which are outlined here on this slide. The ability to implement a successful pretreatment program depends on the existence of legal authority. The POTW must be able to respond to challenges by industrial users to protect its investment in the treatment plant, to ensure the beneficial uses of its waters and to protect the health and welfare of its citizens. The Pretreatment 101 Legal Authority webcast will discuss the minimum federal requirements that a POTW must be able to perform. As part of the POTW's legal authority to implement a pretreatment program, the POTW must have the authority to issue control mechanisms to industrial users. Minimum legal requirements and writing and issuing control mechanisms, which is the generic term for permits, will be another webcast in our series. 40 CFR 403.8F2 requires pretreatment programs to adopt certain procedures to carry out the program. One of these is to develop and implement procedures to randomly sample and analyze effluent from industrial users, and also to regularly sample, analyze, and inspect the certain subset of those industrial users, which we call significant industrial users. Inspections and monitoring industrial users will be another webcast in our series. CFR 403.8F3 identifies that a POTW must have sufficient resources and qualified personnel to carry out the authorities and procedures, which we described earlier in 40 CFR 403.8F1 and 2. The Funding and Resources webcast will focus on needed resources and staff to implement an effective and efficient pretreatment program. Topics will include discussions on necessary equipment, funding, organization of staff, staff responsibilities, staff qualifications, staffing levels, and implement costs. 40 CFR 403.5C outlines when a POTW must develop and enforce site-specific limits to implement the prohibitions listed at 403.5A1 and B. The Local Limits webcast will be a broad overview of the local limits evaluation and development process. Last but not least in our EPA Introductory Pretreatment webcast series is the Unit on Enforcement. 40 CFR 403.8F5 requires POTWs to develop and implement an enforcement response plan. This plan must contain detailed procedures indicating how a POTW will investigate and respond to incidents of industrial user noncompliance. More advanced topics will be developed at a later date. I'd now like to ask the audience for their input on what topics they would most like to see next presented by EPA. Please select the topic on your screen that you are most interested in. Which topic would you like to have presented next? Legal authority and permitting, compliance, inspections and monitoring, funding, resources, local limits, or enforcement? While we wait for the results, I would like to remind everyone that if there are any technical difficulties, they should call 1-800-833-2812 or click the Help button to receive technical support from ON24. And again, if calling internationally, please call 1-415-829-5211. The event number for this webcast is 218566. Please use this number when requesting assistance so that ON24 staff will know which webcast you are watching. Okay, as we can see here, it looks like the two most favorite topics in our series coming up next have been requested to be the compliance, inspections, and monitoring, and local limits. So thank you for your input. Today, we have Mr. Al Garcia, who will discuss industrial user inventory and characterization. Mr. Garcia's presentation will highlight the federal requirements and procedures on how to conduct an industrial user inventory. Mr. Garcia is the EPA Region 8 Pretreatment Coordinator. Prior to being hired at EPA in 2008, he served in the trenches and has had significant local experience providing regulatory control to industrial and commercial facilities, including sampling, inspections, permit writing, and enforcement. Mr. Garcia has a Bachelor of Science degree in Biology and Chemistry from the University of Northern Colorado. Take it away, Al.
Hey, thanks, Jen. I appreciate the introduction. As Jen mentioned, the purpose of the Pretreatment 101 webcast series is for EPA to help support local programs by providing training and outreach and to really start dialogue that's intended to build strong foundations in local programs. So, as Jen mentioned, I am Al Garcia. I am the Regional Pretreatment Coordinator here in Region 8 in sunny Denver. I hope everyone's having as good as weather as we're having here in Denver. Yes, I've been at EPA for about 3 years. But really, I learned the pretreatment regulations when I was a local pretreatment coordinator, and I was serving in the trenches. I actually started in the trenches. I started off doing sampling and inspections, and believe me, the shine was definitely off when I opened up my first grease interceptor and saw things in there that really no person should be seeing. So the whole point, the whole focus of my presentation is to give you the regulatory background. We're going to discuss the regulations that provide the regulatory background for the industrial waste survey procedures, but we're also going to talk about, some of the lessons learned, some of the mistakes that I made when I was local, and some of the things I see during audits of the industrial pretreatment program. So we will also have an opportunity to discuss the purpose of the industrial waste survey, or as we call it here in Region 8, the industrial user inventory and characterization procedures, and the benefits that a well-developed inventory can provide not only to your pretreatment program, but to your local community. We will also discuss some good operating procedures that, again, these are lessons learned. These are things that you can utilize in your service area to characterize and to notify industrial users on your inventory. So these procedures are intended to really utilize your resources as efficiently as possible while still gathering information that your program can use to determine if these industrial users are significant, first of all, to your program, and if you need to expand resources down the road to control these industrial users. And then finally, we'll also discuss the requirement and the benefit of ensuring that the inventory is maintained and that it's based on current data and information. But before we start talking about the procedures, let's go to the regulations. Let's go to the dry part of the presentation. If you look at the purpose and the applicability that's listed in the general pretreatment regulations, there's really two things that it does. One, it establishes the responsibilities of local government to implement the national pretreatment standards to control pollutants. And the other important point is that these regulations apply to non-domestic sources that discharge to a POTW or that could discharge these pollutants indirectly through truck or transported by rail to your treatment plant. So in order to control these pollutants, in order to understand what these non-domestic sources are, it's important to understand the scope of the non-domestic discharges in the service area that your POTW services. As Jan mentioned in her part of the presentation, these are the building blocks of a pretreatment program. And Jan, she did a really good job of going through the legal authority, the funding resources, local limits, and the ERP. What I'm going to talk about are the implementation procedures and the industrial waste inventory. These are really the building blocks that we evaluate during audits of your local program. The provisions, again, that apply to industrial user inventory are the implementation requirements. Now, if you look at 403.8F2, these include much more than just the implementation requirements for an industrial user inventory. It also includes sampling. It also includes inspections, the ability to receive and to analyze self-monitoring reports, the requirement to evaluate industrial users for slug control, and to determine them for significant noncompliance, or S&C. But these provisions that is located in this regulation, and I'm not going to cite every single regulation because that would take me forever, but I'm going to talk about the provisions in these regulations on the slide. These provisions relate directly to the industrial user inventory and characterization procedures. So let's look at these provisions a little bit more closely. Now, the first part of this, this includes the requirement to identify and to locate all possible industrial users which might be subject to the POTW's pretreatment program. So essentially what this first provision requires you to do is to have an inventory or a survey, at least to understand the industrial users that are in your service area. So to have information to the best of your ability and your resources about existing industrial users in your service area and any new industrial users that may move into your service area or that may move out. So as we all know in the implementation world, and again, I've been doing this locally before I came to EPA for about 16 years. It is very difficult to have a completed industrial user inventory that is updated, that, because of a variety of factors, such as resources and funding of your pretreatment program, the size and the scope of your service area, the number and the type of industrial users in your service area, the transient nature of these industrial users, and then also the outside jurisdictions, the different sanitation districts that may contribute to your PHW, and also the related political environment with these outside jurisdictions. Can you hit the next slide, please? The second provision in the regulations discuss now the requirement to identify the character and the volume of pollutants of the industrial users on your inventory. So that first provision we talked about in the previous slide is the requirement to develop the industrial user inventory. Now this provision requires you to characterize those industrial users on your inventory. And the reality of this is that these two procedures can be done concurrently, but for the sake of discussion, it's easier to talk about the inventory and the procedures for those, then also tools and some methods that you can use to characterize the industrial users on your inventory of your service area. The third provision of these regulations, whenever that comes up, will talk about the notification of industrial users on your service area. So you're required to develop that inventory, to characterize the volume and the character of pollutants, and also to notify these industrial users of any applicable pretreatment standards under the Clean Water Act and other applicable requirements, such as those for RCRA or the hazardous waste management. So it's really three things: the inventory, characterization, and the notification. Now, if we go back to the regulations, in 403.8 F6, this is the requirement to have the industrial user inventory. There's really two important points. The next slide. Thank you. There's really two important points from this regulation. One is that you need to develop a list of industrial users that meet the SIU definition, the significant industrial user definition that is found in 403.3 V1, which we will discuss later in this presentation. The other important point is that you need to identify not only the criteria for the SIU that's applicable to each industrial user, but also the determinations for non-SIUs that may meet the local criteria for significance, but you have a determination that they are not significant to your pretreatment operation or any pretreatment standards. So if you look at, now if you start to develop tools in your regulatory toolbox or your regulatory tool belt, or whatever floats your boat, a tool belt or a toolbox, these are some of the tools that you can start to develop when you're looking at the industrial user inventory and characterization procedures. One, these are the procedural tools, and these are the ones that we talked about: the requirement to identify and locate industrial users or the inventory, the requirement to characterize them, and the requirement to notify them. The next tools in your toolbox are the definitions that we'll talk about again a little bit later, but this is your universe. This is your industrial user base and the different sectors within your service area that you can then start to apply your pretreatment standards to see if they meet these definitions. The next tools in your regulatory toolbox or tool belt are these. In 403.3 V3, which is the third provision of the SIU definition, this gives you that authority to designate industrial users as non-SIUs. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. The application of categorical pretreatment standards apply to categorical industrial users. And then again, as we discussed, the requirement to prepare and to maintain a list of industrial users in your service area. So that's the dry part of the presentation. That's the regulations. Now let's talk about procedures. Let's talk about, implementation world reality, realistically. How are we going to establish a list of industrial users in your service area? Well, and again, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, that it's easier to think of this as really being in two phases. One is that the first part of it is to develop that industrial user inventory, to have procedures and methods and tools that you can use to develop that inventory. And the other one are to develop, again, procedures, tools, and methods to characterize and to notify the industry users on that inventory. So before we begin the discussion of these procedures, let's go back and review the purpose of the industry user inventory. And again, to reemphasize, the industry user inventory is important because it really provides you, the local pre-treatment program, information about industry users that have the potential to cause interference or cause pass-through at your treatment plant, has the potential to cause contamination to your sludge, and that may affect your disposal for that sludge. And something that's always been very important to me and a priority to me when I was local and also here at EPA, any industry users that have the potential to cause an impact on your POTW and your collection system and the workers at these systems. We all know that we have operators at our plant, but we have a large number of workers that do work in your collection system, and you want to make sure that to the best of your ability, you're able to control industry users and their pollutants that may have an impact on these workers. So the first phase of these procedures, the development of the industry user inventory. So why are these necessary? Well, there are some benefits to having a well-developed inventory. The important thing to understand is that this is really your first exposure to the industry users. This allows you to determine if the industry user is significant according to your pre-treatment standards that you apply to them. This gives you the ability to notify the industry users of their status under the pre-treatment regulations, and then also to determine the appropriate type of control mechanisms for these facilities in order to protect your POTW and your collection system. Also, this exposure to the industry users allow your program to provide outreach to these facilities. So those facilities that are right on the border of being significant because of, let's say, for example, slug control issues or spill potential, this allows you to provide them some outreach, provide them some training, and if they make that decision to implement some measures or some controls, that may take them out of the significant criteria, which will help them, which will help their community, and also will help your pre-treatment program because you won't have to expend the resources down the road in order to control these facilities. But, in the regulations, we do tell you that you have to do it, but we don't tell you how to do it. So there's no prescriptive procedures that are listed in the regulations. There's no one right way. There's no magic formula. And really, it's kind of similar to what I alluded to earlier in the presentation. It's dependent on factors that are specific to your service area or specific to your community or your municipality. So, and again, to reemphasize that, the resources that you have in your program, the size of your service area, the number of outside jurisdictions, the relationship that you have to different departments within your city or your community, the transient nature of industry users, all these are factors that are different from one municipality to another. So as a result of these factors, the industry user inventory is a dynamic and it's a fluid process. It may not ever be complete. It may not ever be 100% capturing your service area, but that's okay. You may need some real-time process adjustments to ensure that information is gathered appropriately to your service area. The important focus to understand for an effective industrial wastewater survey or inventory is to characterize, to survey, or to understand your service area with a list or an inventory or a database, however you want to define that, and to characterize industry users based on current information. So now we're getting into the industry user inventory part of this, and again, to reemphasize, it's important to maintain, to continually update your inventory because of the constant changes in a typical community or service area. There is a need for continual maintenance, but there's some other conditions that may trigger when it's time for you to update your survey or your inventory, and it's these type of triggers. If you develop a new pre-treatment program, if you notice an uptrend in pollutant loadings, or if you have plant violations or upsets. So, for example, if you receive a significant increase in loading for cyanide or conventional pollutants that may impact the operation of your POTW, it's a great idea to have a well-developed inventory so you can tease out that information from your inventory to determine the potential sources for these pollutants. So these are some of the methods and tools that you can use to develop your inventory. There are these tools and methods I think of as more paperwork and more research related. They're very important, but this is more of the reviewing records such as the sewer permit taps, the wastewater and the water billing records, doing drive-bys, doing evaluations of your paper survey, letting your fingers do the walking to the yellow pages. All these things are very important, but these are more paperwork related tools. If you go to EnviroFacts, this is a database that has information for facilities in your service area that are regulated by EPA regulations for air, toxics, water, radiation, and wastewater that may give you an idea of industrial users in your service area. These tools on this slide, I definitely have always believed when I was local that the investment, the outreach, the training that you do, the coordination that you do with other local departments in your city, in your community, will really help you in the long run, because these local or county departments such as building, engineering, community development, fire, police, and code enforcement, they also do business processes at these industrial users for some of their business processes. If you guys can coordinate with these departments, provide them some outreach so they have an awareness of what you're looking for when they're out doing their business at these industrial users, this will result in more eyes for your program out in the service area. And again, if you have anything that you see for the building department or the police or code enforcement, you can also be eyes for them. So this is now more a holistic view of your community, which will pay off for your department in the end. And also, if you can, it's a worthwhile investment for your program to be part of their business processes. So, for example, if you can include your paper survey to be part of the building permit package, it is a valuable tool for your program to be a reviewer and required to sign off on that building permit process before that building permit is finalized. This will ensure that you get information that will be valuable for your program. Here's some other tools to look at when you're developing your industrial user inventory. And again, any users with high water usage based on the records that you look at for water and wastewater, the SIC codes and the NAICS codes are really valuable because these are standards that are used by agencies in classifying business establishments. So these standardize the processes that you may see out in your service area. The important thing to look at are try to find any industrial users that may impact your wastewater treatment plant. So again, now you're starting to get in information. You are developing your inventory. You are starting to gather information. Now it's time to look at, okay, how are you going to sort this? How are you going to compile this in order to make this a useful tool for you? And again, the regulations do not provide specific requirements as to the nature of this list or this inventory or this database. The database could be paper or electronic, but the important focus for this is that this database is a functional day-to-day tool for your program to use. It's not just an exercise for you to prepare for the regulators during program audits or during annual reporting. A functional database, however you define that, should be well organized. It should include the characterization information on the industrial users, and it should be accessible to your program and to other departments within your city. So because according to the regulations, you have to have criteria that characterizes the SIU. This slide includes some criteria that you can use, and this will give you information that you can use to characterize the industrial users for significance. But by no means is this the complete list. But by no means could this be something that every city would adopt, because I've seen some inventories that include criteria that, for example, go beyond this and include information for sewer or water service. So, for example, if the industrial user is on well water or on a septic system, this is useful information that may be applicable to your service area and to your pretreatment program. It may also be a good idea to include organization to include information on pollutants of concern that you may have in your service area, such as oil and grease restaurants, the dental facilities for mercury, and so forth and so forth. It may be a good idea to start carving out your service area in your inventory to include that type of information. A side benefit of a well-developed industrial user inventory is that it could provide information that could be useful not only to your program, but to your community. So, for example, because you're gathering information from the water and wastewater billing, you may find industrial users that, again, may be on septic, but not connected to the sanitary sewers. So these industrial users may still be discharging toxic pollutants to your service area, to your community, but not necessarily to the sanitary sewer service, which the pretreatment regulations apply to. I know of a couple states where the industrial users could be adequately controlled through the underground injection control program that is administered by the state. So just because you have this information and just because the pretreatment regulations don't apply to this, don't trash this data. Don't trash this information, because this could be useful to the state that they can use to control these industrial users, which is the overall, it's a good thing. It's a benefit to your community. So conversely, you may find industrial users that are connected to the sanitary sewer system but are on well water. This information could be useful to your fire and your code department. So this list, in other words, could be used to provide a holistic view of your community. Now, when you're looking at this industrial user inventory and characterizing, there are many cities that have established sector control programs that are based on best management practices. So, the whole focus should not just be on permits, on control mechanisms. It should be on things that, it should be on industrial users that you need to identify, that you need to characterize, and to control in order to protect your treatment plant and your collection system and the concerns that you have locally. So, as we're going on the presentation, the next important thing is so what's the purpose of developing the industrial user inventory and characterizing industrial users? So when this slide comes up, we're going to talk about your universe. We're going to talk about industrial users. We're going to talk about the criteria for significant industrial users, the non-significant categorical industrial users, and the non-SIUs. We'll talk about these. So an industrial user, there's two things. One, it's a non-domestic source. These are commercial and industrial facilities. These are not the residents, but anything that's commercial or industrial in your service area that discharge pollutants into your collection system. So this is the universe that you apply the pretreatment standards to. Now, a significant industrial user, there's really two parts to being there's two subcategories being for a significant industrial user. The first bullet on the slide talks about categorical industrial user. These are still significant industrial user. It's just that they're significant because of the categorical pretreatment standards. Now, these categorical pretreatment standards are developed by EPA, and they're based on treatment technology. These essentially establish a level playing field throughout the United States. Typically, it's not always the case, but typically the categorical pretreatment standards are applicable to an industrial user based on the process that they employ. I believe now we have about 56 current effluent limitation guidelines, which include categorical pretreatment standards, and there's more in development. The next three bullets on the slide contain criteria that address local criteria, either local limits or other local concerns. The last bullet on this one, this allows you to have the ability to define an industrial user as a significant industrial user based on the reasonable potential to violate pretreatment standards or requirements. So this is where you can apply the local limits to. Okay, so non-significant categorical industrial users. Now, just one thing before we start about with this criteria is that if you're in a state where the state is your approval authority, you need to ensure that the state has incorporated the 2005 pretreatment streamlining regulations into their statute before you're able to adopt this into your local ordinance or your rules and regulations. But if you do have that ability, then you can determine categorical industrial users as non-significant if they meet this criteria. One, if they discharge less than 100 gallons per day of total categorical wastewater. Two, if they're consistently compliant with all applicable standards and requirements for that categorical process. And when we go out as EPA, as approval authority, to look at your program, we will look to ensure that there's at least 3 years of consistent compliance with these standards and requirements. The final one is that they never discharge any untreated concentrated wastewater, such as chemical baths at the metal finishing facilities to your POW. If they meet these requirements and you have that authority to implement this optional provision of the pretreatment streamlining regulations, you can then apply this to these. A non-significant industrial user, this is not applicable to the categorical pretreatment standards, but these are for significant industrial users that meet your local criteria. They have a potential, so if you apply local limits or if they're above that 25,000 gallons per day, or if they're 5% of your hydraulic or your organic design capacity of a PHW, but they don't have any reasonable potential for adversely affecting your PHW's operation or for violating any pretreatment standards or requirements, you can make a determination that they are not a significant industrial user as long as you have the appropriate justification. So now we have that inventory, and so what we're going to start now doing is applying the pretreatment standards. So essentially applying that filter. We're applying the pretreatment standards to these industrial user and the information that we gathered from them to characterize them to see if they're significant to us based on these standards. The three standards that we apply are the National Prohibited Discharges standards, the Categorical Pretreatment standards, and the local limits or other local concerns that you have in your service area. National prohibited standards. These are ones that are developed by EPA and are in this regulatory provision. The first one is a general discharge prohibition that no user shall introduce any pollutant which causes pass-through or interference. The other ones are specific prohibitions that relate to fire, explosion hazards, corrosive structural damages, any of these conditions that may occur in your collection system or at your POTW. Now, there are some local programs that have adopted additional prohibited discharges that provide additional protection to their collection system or to the POTW, such as color or odor or any improperly shredded solids. So if you're going to categorize industrial users for the categorical pretreatment standards, here's some useful tools that you can use. All the regulations are in the Code of Federal Regulations. If you Google ECFR, there's a web page that you can go and look at these electronically. Now, they're there, they're dry, and I find that the CFR book and a glass of warm milk will put me right to sleep. But they're there for you to look at. The EPA Effluent Limitation Guidelines webpage at this web link is a really good webpage because this provides you not only the regulations, but it also provides you the development documents, preambles to the rulemaking. It provides you the responses that we had to comments, and it also provides you any guidance manuals that may have been developed for these categorical pretreatment standards. I definitely believe in using your peers in talking and brainstorming these situations with your peers because there's a lot of good experience out there in the local programs in the United States. I would definitely use your peers to help you with your local program. In fact, there is a Yahoo Pretreatment Coordinators group that is really active and that may help your local program. And then also, this is what we get paid for. By all means, please use your approval authorities, either at the state or at EPA, and we'd be happy to help to walk you through some of these situations that you may have on whether or not the categorical pretreatment standards apply to industrial users in your service area. For local concerns, this is now the third layer. This is now that third standard that you apply. All these standards are equally important, but this third layer are your local concerns. These could either be the local limits that you developed. You want to make sure that your local limits are technically based. They're based on a good data set, and they're based on current standards. So any local limits that you have developed, you want to start to make determinations on whether or not these industrial users are applicable to your service area. And any other local concerns that you have, such as best management practices, such as vector control programs for oil and grease at restaurants and for mercury. And if you have any local pollutants of concern, such as lindane, molybdenum, oil and grease, mercury, and silver. Now, you'll see that these tools on the next slide for methods and tools for obtaining information at these industrial users are kind of similar to the tools and the methods and procedures for developing the industrial user inventory. So drive-bys or windshield inspections, the use of your paper survey. If you do have a paper survey and if you use that out, it's a useful tool, but make sure that you have a good cover letter that includes the purpose of the industrial user survey, any deadlines that you have for having these come back to you, and what is required in order to ensure that this survey is completed. So, and if you get back these surveys in a big batch, do not just put them in the corner. And I remember when I was local, I used to have a lot of these in the corner that I needed to get to. It's a priority, so make sure that these surveys are tracked and that you have some response and some follow-up, so you can use that information that you gather for your program as far as determinations. Facility inspections is also another good tool that you can use. If we had unlimited resources and funding, we can hire people, we can go out and do inspections of every single industrial user in our service area, but that is not realistic. So, you want to try to find a way to efficiently use the resources, the funding that you do have in order to gather that type of information. You also may need to do some sampling and the evaluation of their chemical inventory to make sure that you have the information that you need in order to determine if these industrial users need to be controlled, if they're significant, and if long-term you need to expend resources in order to control these industrial users in your service area. Now, on slide 43, hopefully this is up for everyone, but I'm a really visual person. So I like to see how these procedures, how they're up in a flow chart and how they work visually for a program. So what you can see, if this slide is up, I'm not sure, it doesn't show up on my slide, but what I try to do is to put together a flow chart that will show you how these procedures can work for your program. As you walk through this slide, and again, I'm talking blind here, but as you walk through this slide, what you can do is start to separate. You can start to carve out the industrial users in your service area. So, when you start off, you have your universe of industrial users with unknowns. Okay, we are at step one. As you start to look at your industrial users, you can characterize a lot of those industrial users by name or by common knowledge. So, for example, if you have a Best Buy, by name or by common knowledge that most likely they will not have a processed wastewater that you need to be concerned about. So you can characterize them as a non-significant industrial user. A Burger King, on the other hand, or a McDonald's or a Taco Bell, these facilities usually have some discharges that are significant to a local program. It may not be significant enough for you to permit them, but you can definitely include them on your FOG program to ensure that they implement best management practices, that they are controlled, and the pollutant of concern that you have for oil and grease is controlled adequately for your collection system. As you walk down this slide, okay, so the next layer that you would look at are ones where you need to gather more information, possibly through a survey or possibly through a phone call. Keith's Leather and Emporium, I hear that they make the best leather products in town, but they don't have a processed wastewater discharge you need to be concerned about. So again, you would have them as a non-SIU, whereas you go over to Jay's Metals, and they have a chemical etching process that most likely could be subject to the categorical pretreatment standards for metal finishing or for electroplating, and you could then have them as a significant industrial user with pretreatment requirements in the right side of this slide. As you go down further, you may not gather information enough through phone call or through surveys. You may have to go out there and do an inspection of these facilities. So what we've done is taken care of a certain percentage of your service area through common knowledge and through information gathering through surveys and phone calls. Now we're looking at the remaining industrial users that you may have to go do an inspections. So you go out to plastic widgets, and they may have a discharge over 25,000 gallons per day, but it's non-contact cooling water. So again, these you can definitely classify as a non-significant industrial user if they don't have that reasonable potential to impact your operation or to violate any pretreatment standards or requirements. Whereas Pulse Trucking, they get trucks 24/7 and it's 7 days a week, and they clean the interior of the chemical tanks. You have gathered that information through your inspection. Now you have them as an SIU, and you would have them under a permit, possibly under the transportation equipment cleaning operation. However, you've taken care of probably a majority of your industrial users. Now there's some facilities where you just don't know. There probably aren't any categorical pretreatment standards that apply to them, so you may have to do some sampling and some monitoring to make a determination if they discharge any pollutants of concern locally to you or if they meet your local limits. So if we go to water in a bottle and you do some sampling, you see that they don't have any pH issues. So again, the water in a bottle is non-significant. You would not have any pretreatment requirements on them. Whereas for the dairy, for Moo Dairy, you see that they discharge high BOD, they discharge high solids that you may want to include into your surcharge program and have under a permit. So the important thing is that this is now where you're starting to implement your procedures to carve out your service area to make determinations on industrial users. Plastic widgets and the water in a bottle, even though they may not be significant to you now, if they have any process changes, they may be significant in the future. So you always want to make sure at the very last part of this, you have maintenance and checkups as part of your industrial user inventory and characterization procedures. So as we go through this flow chart, as we go through these procedures, and we're now starting to make determinations of these industrial users, this next slide will show you this is what a well-developed procedure can show you for your service area. This will then start to separate and to give yourself a visual of what does your service area look at. What does it look like? So if you look at the very top of this slide, this is your universe. These are all industrial users. And if you go over to the left of the slide, these are the significant industrial users that you may have under a permit. These are the ones that are either significant based on categorical standards or the categorical users, or they could be significant based on your local limits or your local concerns, or the non-categorical users, significant industrial users. If you go over to the right of the slide, these are the non-SIUs. These are the ones that you don't necessarily have under a permit. All the way to the right are the non-significant industrial users. These are the non-SIUs. These are the ones where you don't have any pretreatment requirements, such as Best Buy or those type of facilities. You may have some industrial users where you may want to implement BMPs or implement a fog program in order to control oil and grease, not necessarily under permit, but under BMPs, under the best management practices in order to control those pollutants. So this is where you can see and start to carve out your service area into where do you need to expand your resources for permits, for BMPs, for those type of situations. This is where you can start to do planning on resources for your pretreatment program. So moving on, the second phase, the last part of this phase is to notify these industrial users of the applicable pretreatment standards. And this is an important provision of the pretreatment regulations that is sometimes overlooked. You definitely want to notify them. I recommend that local programs always follow up inspections with a letter that describes the characterization. That is, it notifies the industrial user of applicable pretreatment standards, and then also include language that requires the industrial user to notify you if should they have any significant process changes at their facility. This puts this industrial user on notice that they need to provide information for you, and this will help you trying to ensure that the inventory is maintained and is based on current data. So back to the regulations, under the annual reports, there is a provision that you include the updated list of industrial users and that these be included on the annual reports. There is that provision under the annual reports, and it has this type of criteria that you need to add to that part of the annual report. Now, because you're required to accurately report to your approval authority, whether at the state or the EPA, this is your incentive. This is your trigger to ensure that the industrial user inventory, your list of IUs, is maintained and it's based on current data and information. So, again, the maintenance of the industrial user inventory is not a one-time shot. It's a continual maintenance. It's required by the regulations, and to effectively utilize your resources, what I try to recommend to programs is to target these industrial users of concern, such as plastic widgets or the water in a bottle, that if they have any process changes, would they be a concern to you down the road? So target these for possibly some more frequent maintenance than a Best Buy, for example. Or if you have any sectors of concern, such as machine shops. If a machine shop has a plating line, they're automatically going to be significant according to the categorical pretreatment standards found under the metal finishing regulations. So try to utilize your resources by targeting these type of industrial users or sectors in your inventory. So to summarize, Well, there is no one right way. There is no magic formula to have these procedures for your industrial user inventory and characterization. These are required by the pretreatment regulations. There's no doubt about it. These are resource intensive. It takes some planning. It takes some thought processes. It takes sometimes some mid-process adjustments based on the specific factors in your municipality. The follow-through and documentation is vital. It's the important component of your inventory. It's a fluid and dynamic process, and maintenance is important. So with that, I'm done with my presentation.
Okay, thank you, Al, for that informative presentation. I'd like to remind the audience that questions can be submitted at any time during the webcast. Also, you may have a question now that we may be answering in the very next presentation. And now I'd like to ask another question of you guys. Which of the following below best describes your agency? Do you work at a POTW or municipality, state regulatory office, federal regulatory office, different type of environmental organization such as a consulting firm or an environmental active group, an industry, or something else? Please submit your answer. And while the system is processing your answers, I'd like to let you all know that EPA currently is updating its guidance manuals for POTWs. One of the ones that we're currently working on is how to develop a pretreatment program. And in that manual, we will be discussing how to conduct an industrial user inventory. And be looking for that coming soon. Okay, another question. What do you do with and how do you deal with finding industries that might be outside of your jurisdiction but into your collection system? That is a situation that we are going to be dealing with in the manual and discussion on legal authority because it has to do with interjurisdictional agreements. The long and short is it's still important for you to know all of the industrial users that are coming into your system because if they can potentially affect your POTW compliance, you need to ensure that you are still protecting your POTW and your NPDES permit requirements. Okay, next poll question. For the POTW folks, how is your POTW currently maintaining your industrial user inventory? Are you using a spreadsheet, an electronic database or spreadsheet, hard copy files, you don't have a current inventory, or it's not applicable to you because you're not one of the POTWs that's in attendance today? Please submit your answers. Okay, let's see if we have another question. All right. To include an industrial user under the category of a potential corrosion issue, if they're using a neutralization system to achieve this good pH value, would you still consider this a pH issue and call this an industrial user even if they're in good compliance? Al, have you dealt with that situation?
Well, as far as this situation, it's a lot of times it's dependent on your service area, on your collection system. For sure, if you have older pipes or if you have older manhole covers or, the structure of your collection system, if that's a local concern and if you feel that operator error or changes in the volume or changes in the process could impact something down the road, that's something that you can make that decision. You have the authority to determine if they're significant industrial users, but that would be more specific from one municipality to another. But you do have that ability to determine them to be significant if you feel they have reasonable potential to cause or contribute any type of damage into your collection system.
Okay, thank you, Al. In our next discussion, we are going to be discussing some of the success stories, problem areas, and we'll probably discuss more of that type of nature. Now, some of the answer to our poll questions. Looks like the majority of our participants today are from municipalities or otherwise known POTWs. And regarding the types of ways that the POTWs are currently maintaining their industrial user inventory, most of you seem to be using electronic databases. And I will agree, that's probably everything that I have seen out there. It's really when you get into tiny town USA, you might have something more in the paper aspect. Okay. Next up, we also have Ms. Christine Wong, who will discuss what POTWs should do after the industrial user inventory is completed, and some procedures for updating inventory information. Christine Wong has worked as an EPA contractor with the National Pretreatment Program for the past 8 years and with the pretreatment team at Tetra Tech based in Fairfax, Virginia for the past 6 years. She has practical field experience in reviewing pretreatment programs, having conducted 75 pretreatment compliance inspections and audits in several different states and EPA regions. Ms. Wong holds a Master's of Science in Earth Sciences from Dartmouth College and a Master's of Natural Resources from Virginia Tech.
Thanks, Jan. Oops, sorry. Hi, everybody. I'm Christine Wong. Today I'm going to talk about keeping your industrial user, or IU inventory, up to date once you've completed your initial inventory. Alice already so thoroughly covered that. I am going to discuss why you need to do it, how you can do it, and what to do when you find things have changed at your IUs. Please keep in mind that my approach to IU inventory updates come from the auditor's perspective, such as when your approval authority audits or inspects your program. So why is it necessary to update IU inventory information? As Al said, POTWs with approved pretreatment programs are required to report at a minimum once a year in their annual report about this information. Every year, you're required to provide a brief description of each deletion and addition to your IU inventory. This is the inventory. It is a list of significant industrial users, or SIUs, that fulfills the requirements at 40 CFR 403.8F6. For all the IUs in your inventory, you are required to identify the information listed on this slide, including identifying SIUs, categorical industrial users, or CIUs, and non-significant CIUs so they can be properly regulated. What about those POTWs that don't have approved pretreatment programs? They actually have very similar reporting requirements. All POTWs with MPDS permits are required to provide adequate notice regarding any new or substantial changes to the nature and volume of pollutants being introduced into the POTW from an indirect discharger. So what's adequate notice? All POTWs with MPDS permits, which includes POTWs with approved pretreatment programs, are required to report to their permitting authority in advance of the anticipated impact of the new or changed discharges from the facilities on the updated IU inventory. That is, before the facility in question begins or substantially changes its discharge. In my notes, in advance is in all caps. It is important to note this clause indicates that adequate notice can mean providing your updated IU inventory to your permitting authority more than once a year. So why does your permitting authority need adequate notice? Your permitting authority needs to have enough time to determine if your MPDS permit would require modification, such as adding limits or monitoring requirements, or the requirement to develop and implement a pretreatment program if these new or changed discharges represent a reasonable potential to impact your plant. You are required to submit a great deal of information about these new or changed IU discharges, including the quality and quantity of effluent introduced into the POTW and the anticipated impact of the change on the quality or quantity of effluent to be discharged from the POTW. Thus, in practice, all POTWs with MPDS permits are required to regularly update their IU inventories. There are, of course, other reasons to update your IU inventory, which Al touched upon. You're required to have adequate resources to implement your pretreatment program. It takes a lot of time and effort to conduct adequate oversight of a pretreatment program, so you need to have a good handle on the size and complexity of your oversight universe. so you can request or make a good case to management for getting the resources, such as personnel and funding, that you need to run your program. In addition, you need to know the quantity and types of pollutants that are coming into your plant, so you can protect both the plant and the environment. The purpose of the MPDS program is to protect the operation of the plant and ultimately the environment, so it is critical to have this information. There are two main time periods for updating your IU inventory. You can do it by making continual updates and also by making periodic updates. When I refer to these time periods, I'm talking about the information that the POTW requests and receives from its IUs. Continual updating would be represented by a facility that continually or regularly receives information about new IUs or changes at existing IUs from outside sources, such as the City Business Licensing Office or the Planning Department, and would respond to actionable information from these sources in real time, such as sending out a short survey to any potential IU identified through this information. Periodic updating would be represented by a facility that only receives information about new IUs or changes at existing IUs from outside sources over defined periods. For example, a facility that only checks in with other city departments once a year. A POTW obviously cannot be sending out surveys or conducting inspections every day to look for IUs, so this comparison does not apply to the information that the POTW actively pursues, such as phone book reviews and facility inspections at industrial parks. However, keep in mind that the more often you perform these types of activities, the more useful they will be for keeping your IU inventory up to date. Now let's talk about some pros and cons of continual versus periodic updates. EPA recommends in the Guidance Manual for POTW Pretreatment Program Development that POTWs update their IU inventory information on a continual basis. In other words, as close to real time as possible. Continual updates are more proactive rather than reactive, and it is always better to be proactive in locating possible IUs. By being proactive, POTWs will be able to educate potential IUs about the necessary requirements for wastewater discharge. So it's less likely that an IU's discharge might cause the POTW to violate its MPDS permit conditions by causing pass-through or interference. In a reactive situation, the POTW already has experienced some type of incident, such as sewer overflow, pass-through or interference, or a worker health and safety issue. And then the POTW must try to locate the source that caused the incident. For larger POTWs, it can be less burdensome when IU information is received and reviewed continually, or is then made available, rather than reviewing large batches of IU information or surveys that come in all at once. In addition, continual updates ensure that personnel are always trained to conduct and update the IU inventory. Continual updates are better at capturing the dynamic nature of the program as users enter and leave the system, so it is eventually more protective of the POTW. Finally, continual updating is better because the annual report will be very easy to put together when the time comes. There is a negative side that continual updates are very frequent, so they do require a lot of effort and resources to maintain. On the other hand, periodic updates are less frequent, which may be especially helpful for some smaller programs when a person who may be serving in many different roles at once can find some time to work on the task. There are a number of cons, however, including the reactive and static nature of the update, which is overall less protective of the plant. Hence, EPA's recommendation on continual updates. Another reason to keep your IU inventory up to date is that finding an SIU or CIU that wasn't on your list is one of the most significant findings that an auditor can make. It doesn't look good if your auditor discovers an SIU that wasn't on your list, and there can be reportable and significant noncompliance implications of such a finding. So, how do you update information for existing IUs? If you think about the graphic flow chart in Al's presentation, there are a series of steps you can take to update IU information. First, here are some questions you need to be able to answer about your existing IUs. Most of the questions might need a call or an inspection to verify the information is current. You are interested in any changes in the quantity and quality of wastewater discharged and any changes in the processes, products, or on-site procedures. If the facility has a pretreatment program, all the existing SIUs are required at 40 CFR 403.12J to notify the PHEW prior to any substantial changes in the volume or character of pollutants in their discharge. What about facilities that aren't already permitted? How do they find out about this requirement? PHEW personnel should have some relationship with all IUs that can or are likely to add or change processes that can impact the PHEW or might become subject to categorical standards, and notify those IUs of this requirement. One type of facility that you should keep a watch on would be a food manufacturer that is just under the SIU discharge threshold. Once the PHEW has identified changes at existing IUs, the PHEW should request information to determine if these changes warrant a revision in the facility's classification. Has the facility decreased its discharge below the SIU threshold? Has the IU added categorical processes to its facility, thereby changing its classification from non-categorical SIU to a CIU? Has the CIU eliminated all of its wastewater discharge from a PHEW? The answers to these questions can be requested through a short or long survey form. Short surveys are generally used to obtain updated information at facilities that the PHEW has already identified as IUs. And again, the PHEW will likely need to conduct site visits to verify the information received from the IU. Site visits can be conducted to determine the type and extent of changes to the facility and expand information gathering efforts to determine if a facility needs to be reclassified. Appendix 2 of EPA's Industrial User Inspection and Sampling Manual contains industry-specific questions. Even though these questions were developed for the 1994 document, they are still useful in assisting the PHEW in determining whether a facility should be listed as an IU of concern for the PHEW's NPDES permit. The appendix lists questions for many major IU categories, and not just facilities that have categorical standards. For example, there are questions to ask at leather tanning facilities, laundries, metal shops, and schools. And so the questions or the appendix I referred to is on the slide at that link. I mentioned it before, and Al talked about it a little, but it's worth mentioning again. Working with agencies such as city planning or economic development departments is a great way to have additional eyes in the field to help identify IUs. PHEWs should have procedures in place to receive regular updates on new business license applications, building permit requests, as well as water and sewer connection requests. These procedures should ensure that applicant information is shared across agencies on a regular basis. PHEW staff should then review applications and requests to determine if further follow-up is needed. It's also helpful to get hazmat permit information, as hazmat permits may indicate the presence of a process that warrants a discharge permit. Field observations are also a great way to find operating IUs that have not already been identified. Sewer collection crews should update PHEW personnel regarding anything unusual, such as sewer blockages, corrosion, and unusual odors or colors, that good stuff. Internet searches, phone book reviews, and public notices are also good ways to look for potential IUs. In addition, don't discount the IUs themselves. IUs often have very good information about similar processes at other facilities, so it can be a good idea to talk to them about their competition. Field surveys in general industrial areas can also be very useful. For example, small metal working shops tend to come and go and can set up in very small workspaces. Please keep in mind that all the methods described are ones that an auditor might use to look for potential IUs in your area. So these on the slide are some questions, key questions in determining new SIUs for your inventory. If you have found processes on site at a facility that are federally regulated, or if wastewater discharge flow exceeds the SIU threshold, or if any pollutants discharge might cause plant interference or pass-through, you have found a new SIU or CIU. If you can't answer these questions definitively based on the information you've already gathered, you must request additional information to help you complete your determination. You can send out short or long surveys to gather information about new IUs or changes at existing IUs. For potential SIUs, including new facilities, and for determining whether significant changes have occurred at existing facilities, you should use the long form, which asks much more detailed questions about processes and pollutant discharges. In my experience, many cities use their permit applications as this long form survey. Here is one example of a short survey form used by the folks in Sumner, Washington. If you'd like to use it, it's at the website provided and also on our resources document for this webcast. So looking at the form, it asks for some basic identification information about the facility. It also asks about processes, discharges, and chemicals stored on site. Distributing this survey, as Al mentioned, informs IUs that the POTW is interested in the requested information. The completion of the signature section demonstrates the facility is aware of this, and so, if the POTW later finds out that items of interest are different than reported, the facility cannot claim ignorance of the city's interest, and the POTW has some leverage for potential enforcement actions. And here's just another example of a short survey from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. It, along with many other program documents, is available at the website provided and also in the resources document at our webcast. Okay, so you've gathered all this information. Now what? Let us take a look at a few reclassification scenarios of changes at existing IUs. Scenario 1. Here is a situation that calls for reclassification of an IU to an SIU. A facility is discharging any wastewater that has the potential to violate pretreatment standards can be classified as an SIU. This last clause listed on the slide gives the POTW a great deal of discretion in what types of wastewater might qualify as a facility as an SIU. It means that any facility you think that could come close to exceeding your narrative or numeric local limits could or should be classified as an SIU. One example of this situation is a food manufacturer that has added a new processing line and now exceeds the SIU discharge threshold. Another example is that a commercial laundry that begins washing shop rags and mats, so now could be discharging metals for which your city has local limits. If information indicates that a facility has become an SIU, a POTW with an approved pretreatment program is required to reclassify and permit the facility and add it to its IU inventory. A POTW without an approved program must add the facility to its IU inventory and comply with any other relevant requirements in its NPDES permit. All right, scenario 2. Here are some situations where an IU could become a CIU. For example, when EPA promulgates categorical requirements for a new industry sector, those facilities become CIUs on the effective date of the rule. The latest industry sectors affecting indirect dischargers are centralized waste treatment, which was promulgated in December 2000 at 40 CFR Part 437, and transportation equipment cleaning, which was promulgated in August 2000 at 40 CFR Part 442. The addition of or change in processing lines and the addition of or change in products can also result in a facility needing a CIU reclassification. One example of this scenario is a dry metal working shop that adds dip tanks to treat the metal surface and then discharges the resulting processed wastewater. This slide lists examples of ways that SIUs can become zero dischargers. Simply put, an SIU that stops discharging is a zero discharger. An example of this is a large photo processing facility that installs a heat system that evaporates all of its processed wastewater. That would become a zero discharger. Now, a POTW with an approved pretreatment program would remove a zero discharging SIU from its IU inventory. But the POTW should still conduct oversight activities for these facilities to ensure that they are not resumed discharging or are illicitly dumping, for example. A POTW without an approved pretreatment program would just need to remove the facility from its IU inventory. Next scenario. There are situations in which a CIU might become a non-significant CIU or NSCIU. As Al mentioned, to use this NSCIU designation, the control authority must first ensure that its state has adopted this provision from the 2005 revisions to the general pretreatment regulations into its state rules and regulations. I switched to control authority here from POTW in reference to states that might serve as the control authority for SIUs in cities without approved pretreatment programs. Once a state has adopted the provision, then a POTW with an approved program must incorporate this provision into its legal authority, such as in its sewer use ordinance. Only then may the POTW implement this NSCIU designation. Once the provision has been properly incorporated into the applicable legal authority, facilities that meet these criteria, discharging less than 100 gallons per day, never discharging concentrated processed wastewater, and being in constant or consistent compliance with regulations and requirements, only these facilities can be regulated as NSCIU. Control authorities that do not have adequate authority to implement the NSCIU designation must permit and regulate CIUs that discharge any amount of processed wastewater as a significant CIU. Zero discharges are a type of NSCIU. So all NSCIUs, including zero discharge CIUs, are required to submit annual certifications and are required to notify the control authority in advance of any substantial change in the volume or character of pollutants in their discharge. An example of this scenario is a semiconductor manufacturer that generates just a few gallons a day of processed wastewater. The facility can either discharge or collect and haul away its wastewater, and in either situation, it could be classified as an NSCIU as long as the control authority has the proper authority. And finally, processes at an SIU can change such that it becomes an ordinary IU. If the facility reduced its wastewater discharge, reduced its pollutant loading, or perhaps improved pollution prevention and recycling procedures, it might no longer qualify as an SIU. A food manufacturer whose discharge falls below the SIU threshold could be reclassified as a non-significant SIU. The POTW does have the discretion, however, to maintain the SIU classification as long as the facility's wastewater has the potential to violate pretreatment standards. If the facility POTW decides to reclassify the facility, the oversight requirements are the same as the case of the SIU becoming a zero discharger. All the classification changes that were mentioned should be specified in your annual report or regular notification to your NPDES permitting authority. So, when you find a new SIU, a POTW with an approved pretreatment program must add it to its IU inventory, issue it a control mechanism, and conduct regular inspections and sampling at the facility. For a POTW without an approved pretreatment program, the POTW must add the SIU to its inventory and comply with any relevant requirements in its NPDES permit. The POTW could be in violation of its pretreatment program implementation or NPDES requirements for the period in which an SIU is discharging and a POTW did not provide adequate oversight. From an auditor's point of view, these facilities could qualify as facilities that were not adequately controlled by a control mechanism and were not sampled or inspected as required. And all of these items have reportable or significant noncompliance implications for POTWs. Keep in mind that a POTW not knowing about a discharging SIU is no excuse for inadequate implementation procedures, because that is the whole point of having an updated IU inventory. So as a reminder, updates to your IU inventory must be submitted each year in your annual report. You must include all the information listed on the slide if you are a POTW with an approved pretreatment program. And once again, all POTWs with NPDES permits must provide adequate notice to their permitting authority. So the bottom line, again, is that everyone has to regularly update their IU inventory. Okay, that's it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Christine. I'd like to ask the audience to take a moment now to answer the fourth question on your screen before we continue on to a panel discussion with our speakers. And while you all are answering the poll question, we might be able to answer some of the questions that have been coming in. So, first tell us, how many people are participating in the webcast today at your location? Is it just you? 2 to 5 people? 6 to 10? 10 to 20? Or more than 20? Okay. Christine, one of the questions came in was, when is my annual report due? When do I have to submit it? You mentioned that I'm supposed to submit this information on an annual report.
Well, the annual report requirement should be in your MPDS permit. There should be a date specified. And if not, talk to your permitting authority.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. We do have some answers in already. The majority of you are just you in front of your computer. Next, we have 2 to 5 people. So we're pretty much doing well with small groups. Okay, another question. Is a non-significant CIU considered significant?
This one's fun. No, a non-significant CIU is not a significant industrial user. However, an SIU is still a categorical industrial user. And this may confuse people who have heard that all CIUs are SIUs, and they were until 2005 when the general revisions to the streamlining rule went in. And so now this is the exception to where all CIUs are SIUs. Again, an NSCIU is a significant industrial user, is not a significant industrial user, but it should still be counted as a CIU.
And follow up to that question, so if I find I have some small CIUs out there, can I immediately declare that they're a non-significant CIU?
If you remember my long lecture on legal authority, if your state has the legal authority to implement NSCIU, and then you've adopted it into your legal authority, such as your sewer use ordinance, then yes, you may declare them to be NSCIUs, if they meet the 3 required elements of being an NSCIU, which both Al and I read to you, so are in the presentation.
Okay, so for one of those, for example, unless I have data that shows that those facilities have been in consistent compliance, I can't immediately assume that they've been in consistent compliance, can I?
No, you definitely need to have a history for each facility that you wish to classify as an NSCIU. It is not acceptable to declare a facility right out the gate that plans to be in compliance an NSCIU.
So initially then, I would have to assume that that categorical industrial user is significant before I determine otherwise.
Correct. And all of the requirements and regulations that apply to CIUs apply to this little facility.
Okay. We have another poll question for you for the POTWs. How are you currently updating your industrial user inventory? Are you doing it on a continual basis? Just periodically? Not updating it at all? Or it's not applicable because you're not a POTW? Please hit one of the radio buttons and submit your answer. Okay. Everyone quickly answer that being the right answer. You're doing this on a continual basis.
Yay.
And one good reason why you're doing that is because that's the most proactive way to protect your POTW, to make sure that your plant is in compliance and that you, the POTW, don't get an NOV for having a violation of your effluent. So, next up, we are going into the section of our presentation that is a panel discussion. For this final portion, our speakers will present some of the common procedural mistakes and overlooked industrial sectors during the inventory process. The panel will also share some successful inventory stories, and I'd like to remind all the participants that questions or comments can be submitted to the panel at any time, and we'll try to answer as many of these as possible. But you may also find that some of these are in this panel discussion already. So, first slide up, some common industrial wastewater inventory errors. Failure to include all IUs in the master IU list. Failure to conduct follow-up. Failure to document your elimination rationale. Overlooking facilities with private wells but using POTW services. Al, I believe you had a couple of these. Would you like to tell us more about some of them?
Yeah. it's very important for your inventory, to make sure that again, that you have and again, from the realistic side of the regulations, to ensure that you have procedures in place to effectively use your resources to be able to update these. But yeah, I do see some of these sometimes whenever I'm doing audits, and you definitely don't want your auditor to come in and to look through the yellow pages and find categorical industrial users in your service area that you failed to uncover during some of your procedures. So this is all related to continual maintenance of your inventory.
Okay. Some of the common types of facilities that are overlooked are on this next slide. For example, and I think Christine just mentioned some of these, some small metal plating facilities that don't have categorical standards, facilities that might impact the collection system, not necessarily the POTW, but it all depends. So, Christine, have you had some experience with some of these?
Oh, definitely. Let's see. It's a good idea to check on any powder coating facility. It may or may not have a dip line, but you should check anything that says powder coat. And any business that has etch in its name. So those are all good indicators when I'm flipping through, as Al said, the phone book just during my quick audit. It's a good thing to check out all of these and have an answer when your auditor comes and asks you what these facilities do. It's also a good idea to periodically revisit them because they might add a dip tank or change their process. And also for small facilities, they might change hands frequently. So you want to make sure that your presence has registered with these facilities and they understand what you're looking for and under what types of situations that they should contact you to let you know about changes in their facility. I had a couple of things to say also about common industrial user inventory errors, because this is sort of what I see a lot out in the field, and I just wanted to add, in follow-up to the bullet that says failure to document elimination rationale, it is so important to document why it is not an SIU if you've already considered this facility. And no, a rationale in your head doesn't count. When an auditor comes and there's an apparently missing IU determination for facility of interest, it appears to an auditor that you've made an omission and can cause further investigation. And in addition, when you have the documented rationale, that prevents work for, in case of turnover. So your replacement does not have to redo the work because it appears that it wasn't done in the first place. And so it's perfectly acceptable to have a bunch of very skinny files documenting why certain facilities are not SIUs, because a good auditor will come and ask you why.
And I think a follow-up to that is, and if it's not written down, we assume you didn't know and you didn't do it.
Yes, it just looks like an omission. So a lot of this is a paper chase exercise, and so if you can proactively document that you have considered it, that makes everybody happy. And as a follow-up to that, if your auditor does have a list of potential IUs that he found when he was on site and gives you a list of potential SIUs to check out, please make sure that you've checked that list and completed your SIU determinations by the time you're investigated again. Because if the next auditor asks to see that list and you haven't finished looking it up and they do find an SIU, then having that one-year notice looks terrible on your record.
Okay, just as a quick thing and a quick clarification of terms, because certainly if you're new to the pretreatment program, we might be throwing an awful lot of acronyms at you. And I guess that's the consequence of us having been in the program long enough that we think of these acronyms just like the alphabet. So we continue to reference IUs, but then we're also mentioning significant IUs. When we're doing our inventory, are we including all IUs, just SIUs? What are we reporting? For example, when you're starting out your inventory, you include all of them because you haven't yet made that determination of whether or not they are significant industrial users. You have ones that are industrial users, and you may just keep them at that low, small stage of industrial user. Then you will identify that some are appropriately classified as categorical industrial users. Some are significant industrial users based on their process flow being greater than 25,000 gallons per day. Some would be classified as a significant industrial user because their concentration of their waste, the strength of their waste, might be 5% or more of the organic capacity of your POTW. If you look at our current slide, you'll see we have meat and poultry products listed down here. They don't have categorical standards, but often the wastewater coming from such facility might be such of a high-strength waste that it could be causing interference of your POTW just because your POTW can't handle that much of high-strength, high biological oxygen demand type of waste. So that facility, although it's not categorical, it might be considered one of your significant industrial users because it is such a high percentage of your POTW design capacity.
Yeah, Jan, and if I could jump in, the important thing for a pretreatment program is to know what are your local concerns, what are your local limits, because, I have found when I was implementing at a local program that it was easy to apply that filter, so to speak, the national prohibited discharges, the categorical standards. If I understood the applicability, it was relatively easy by definition to apply those. What's difficult is making that determination is what is the concern to you locally? What local limits have you established? And so what standards are these local limits established for? And what are you trying to protect? So some of municipalities are smaller and they have a concern about oil and grease and SSO, so they have a really strong fog sector control program that are based on best management practices. Others don't have those issues. So every municipality has different local concerns. It's important that when you go out and do characterization of these industrial users, when you start to apply those filters, you know what that local filter is, and it'd be easier for you to say, do I need to gather information through a survey, do I need to do sampling, or do I need to do monitoring to determine are they significant according to my local standard?
Definitely, Al. This is Christine. I think that segues nicely into some of the bullets further down on the slide. Those aren't, let's look at prisons, long-term care facilities, hospitals, cafeterias, etc. These aren't necessarily things that would jump out you as an SIU to begin with, but you need to consider them in the context of your community. I know of a POTW in California that has a prison for an IU. The prison's discharges include, lovely things like shredded mattresses and sheets. And these were clogging the sewer lines and ending up in the POTW's biosolids. That is definitely a local program. And the discharges only stopped after the POTW had the prison put in grinders and screens. And as a reminder, anything that impacts the collection system also impacts the plant because by the definition, a POTW includes its collection system.
And actually, speaking along those lines, hospitals are one of those favorite categories that people wonder about, saying that, well, you have people in there, they're doing their, I'll say, normal bodily functions. Isn't that exactly what you have at the residence? Well, yes and no. Remember, those patients are also going through many procedures which tend to concentrate waste, such as dialysis machines, etc. But then hospitals also have cafeterias, and if you have problems with restaurants and oil and grease coming from food service establishments clogging up the collection system, that you might need to look at the cafeteria at the hospital. Also, I know in my local county, we have several of the hospitals that used to take all of their laundry to one of the hospitals. And so that one hospital had a huge industrial laundry. And again, that could give you lots of problems just because of the volume of water coming from that laundry. Hotels can do similar as far as having laundries and cafeterias.
Yeah, Jan, and then also for hospitals, we always, here in Denver, we see hospitals that just continually expand. And as a result of that expansion, there's a need for continually updating their power plant. And something that's overlooked sometimes from hospitals are the impact of pollutants coming out of that power plant as it relates to pH and some other issues. So there have been some communities that have determined them to be significant based on pH issues coming out of hospitals. You'd be amazed on what's being discharged from hospitals.
So I guess all of this is just a reminder that you need to determine what has the potential to impact your plant, and you have to do an investigation and then follow up on that investigation continually to ensure that you're protecting your plant and that everything will be okay.
And actually, on that line, just as a reminder, if you determine one of your industrial users isn't one of your significant industrial users that's potentially causing a problem at your plant today, you might determine after those investigations that 3 years from now, it might be one of your significant industrial users, either because it changed its processes or you changed what you now just suddenly notice was a new issue that you previously hadn't sampled before. Okay, on this slide, we have some particular types of facilities that are overlooked when trying to identify your inventory and your reasons. Let's look at some of those. Christine very much mentioned a bunch of different things about zero discharging and low discharging. Can you discuss that a little bit more?
Well, on the slide, it starts with little metal finishers, perhaps that are zero discharging. A facility can be zero discharging from its primary process, the ones that are involved with the high-strength wastes. But you can't forget the discharges from ancillary processes. There are a whole list at 433 of ancillary processes for which, as long as there is a core process being performed, the ancillary waste is also categorical wastewater. So it is possible to have a facility that is zero discharging from its quote-unquote categorical line, but the discharge from the ancillary processes would have to be counted as categorical waste, so it's not actually a zero discharger. That's a very common misclassification that we see in the field. Let's see, going back to sort of types of little facilities that you might miss, in universities and art schools or artist facilities can sometimes have very small metal etching lines or metal molding and casting or forges. So those might be things you want to check out. They're often zero discharging, or they even could be small discharging lines. So those are some types of zero discharge facilities.
Okay, now when you read steam electric power generating, although certainly this webcast is not focused on to make sure that you are correctly classifying each of these categories, I'd like to point out that one of the nuances in how we write categorical standards is that the steam electric power generating standards actually requires some things such as a no discharge of PCBs. And that's a different type of a zero discharge. That is actually categorical because the actual regulation itself requires no discharge. It's not just that the facility went to zero discharge thanks to wonderful water conservation techniques. The actual standard itself says you will not discharge, period, or you're in violation.
We find that clauses often missing or similar clauses and this is more about permit correct classification and permits, but just FYI, we'll often see a steam electric facility that has the numeric requirements but is missing this Part A requirement of no discharge of PCBs, and that is just as valid and should be written into permits for that type of facility. The second example we had up here was for soap and detergent manufacturing. There is a similar no discharge of wastewater streams meeting a certain COD-BOD7 ratio. That's another example of a categorical subpart that should be included in any applicable permit classifications.
Okay. Last but not least, we'd like to see if between our panel we can come up with some success stories of how actually identifying some of these industrial users, the POTW has solved some of their compliance problems. Okay, Al, can you start us off?
Sure. as far as some of the success stories, I have to admit, I don't have any success stories that are directly implemented by the slide, but I do have some success stories as far as smaller POTWs that have utilized their resources in order to try to gather information to the best of their ability to provide some data that they can use to update their industrial inventory. And I do understand that municipalities, small, medium, and large, have different factors that they need to incorporate into the procedures in order to ensure that they gather that type of information. So just the small, when I went to go do an audit of a small sanitation district, this person was actually doing inspections of all of the industrial users. I believe he had about 100 industrial users. So, he was able to go out there and to effectively use the inspection process to update his information. But what he did to help him to save time was to use a notepad. And I love technology. And he used this notepad to actually do his inspection reports into the notepad. And he brought that notepad back. So what it is, it's a computer notepad. He brought that back and he synced it into his desktop. So all of his information from his inspection was then synced into his database, his electronic database that he used to QA and to QC to make sure that all that information was right when it was in his database. But he used that to really utilize resources and technology. And when I was there for an audit, I was actually awed by this computer notepad. I thought it was really, really kind of cool. From a medium POTW, there is also the use of this database that's electronic, but what they do, they use their computer notebooks to go out there and to gather information, and then when they go back to the car, they put that information to the notebook, and they sync that into the database in the field. So again, that's another way to eliminate the data entry portion, which is resource intensive, but will allow them to maximize their efficiency and their resources to gather this type of information. For large for large PSWs and large service areas, it's difficult. When I was working at my local program, we had 20 sanitation districts, and it was difficult to try to gather information from all those districts. So what we would do is go out there and provide training. It was definitely resource intensive, but it was an investment that we felt would help us in the long run. So we went out and did training for the building departments. We had about, I believe there were 3 or 4 building departments and 20 sanitation districts that we met with them, and we had forums where we would discuss what our concerns were, what our regulations were, try to partner with them, to coordinate with them, to help us to really flesh out information in their sanitation district that would provide us information we can use for industrial user inventory. So these are the type of things that you can use to utilize your resources in order to gather that type of information.
Okay. Christine?
Let's see. How about a general one? I've noticed that a lot of cities have, in the past few years, seem to have developed or have been coming into fruition of very well-developed fog programs. And this program usually involves a lot of proactive footwork where inspectors are going out and cataloging and figuring out where all the restaurants and the auto washes are, and then figuring out which are the problem ones, and then targeting those for BMPs or other requirements. And that has resulted in one of our we always go out and ask about pretreatment pollution prevention successes, and that seems to be one of the best ones, where in number of CSOs and SSOs prevented, that seems to have a great deal of effect. So that's not an example of an SIU, but it is an example of how looking at the IUs in your community can help you to, attack the problems that are of the greatest concern to you.
Okay, I'll throw an example here of a POTW that I know is having issues with having high molybdenum values found in its sludge. And they had searched their well-known industries, their significant industrial users in town, and really weren't finding dischargers of molybdenum. And they started, I don't want to say the phrase wandering around town, but really put their thinking caps on and discovered that a lot of the air conditioning units actually had molybdenum as some of the lubricants in the air conditioning system. And when it was discharging some of the non-contact cooling water, but somewhat contact cooling water, it was actually discharging enough collectively of all the air conditioner units in Florida, they use their air conditioning units an awful lot, and it was accumulating enough in their sludge that they were having problems with molybdenum. So there we had a type of industry that they really weren't calling it one of your traditional industries, because virtually every place had air conditioners. However, they were able to work with the vendors and the service providers who maintained the air conditioner units and got them to change some of the products that they used and virtually eliminated the molybdenum coming into the system. One of the other issues that I know commonly has come up in the past is such things as boiler blowdown, and in the same realm of non-contact cooling water, in that some of these systems will use biocides, fungicides, and therefore it's not just clean water coming through or heated up and cooled down water. It also has all these other chemicals that are added. And you might need to look at some of the quality and the additives that are added to these waters and how much that might be coming through, particularly if it's something that comes through in batch processes. Okay. Before we end this webcast, we would like everyone to complete a survey. And the survey should be coming through with a webcast evaluation soon appearing on your slide. Please complete the survey and let us know your thoughts. We do appreciate your feedback as we work to improve our webcasts and even add more webcasts to our set of presentations that we can provide you. If you don't see the evaluation survey on your screen, please turn off your pop-up blocker. Please double check with that. Let's see, one of the questions that has also come in, since for larger towns we certainly are talking about a lot of industrial users. Al, have you had any experience with finding out places that people might be able to purchase software packages, or do you find people tend to have to create their own Excel or access some sort of electronic spreadsheet package themselves?
Yeah, Jen, I do agree that part of the funding or the resource part of your pretreatment program is trying to find a method, a tool that you can use to compile this type of information. No, I'm not aware of any commercial databases that are available for this type of inventory and the information that you would need on it. So what I've seen during audit are people using Access, people using spreadsheets, to try to impart some sense of organization into all the data that they do receive. But there's no doubt about it. That is one of the challenges of this procedure.
Okay, a quick review. This was your presentation on industrial user wastewater surveys, how to do the inventory, and how to basically what sources you might be able to use to create this inventory. This is one of the elements that starts you off as a pretreatment program requirement initially when you're developing your program. And then the POTW, after it has an approved pretreatment program, at least has to submit an annual update to its permitting authority in accordance with the due date in its NPDES permit. For all POTWs, notifying your permitting authority whenever you receive a new industrial user is a requirement of the NPDES permit regulations. And that you need to report, and also not only report the existence of that new industrial user, but also an evaluation of how you think it might impact your POTW when you tell your permitting authority of that new user to the system. When you're doing your survey, one thing to think about and double check, and something we'll go into vastly more detail on the next webcast on legal authority, is make sure you have the legal authority to go out and ask all these people these questions. That would not be a fun thing to find you have difficulty actually walking in the door of some of these facilities. And with that respect, we use many acronyms in here. Certainly we have a significant industrial user, which are those of 25,000 gallons or more per day, which we need to make sure we identify those. Also 5% or more of the hydraulic or organic capacity of the POTW. Those would also be significant. Categorical industrial users by default are initially significant until until you might have the authority to classify them otherwise. You can't automatically classify a categorical as a non-significant categorical. There's also pre-qualifications on size, compliance, and also just everything in that respect of going out to make sure that it actually is not discharging concentrated wastewater before you could declare it non-categorical. And then also, when you're deciding which of your industrial users are significant, make sure you're thinking about protection of your collection system, not just the POTW plant processes itself. All of these you need to maintain in a continuous fashion so that you can be most protective of your plant and its collection system, because a lot of money and effort and people resources are invested in that entire system. Okay, just to let you all know, you actually listening in our audience are one of almost 1,200 viewers today across 45 states. That's pretty comprehensive there, and I congratulate all of you for tuning in. We have posted the speaker's contact information in case you'd like to contact us after today. We have also posted a comprehensive resource list that you can find by pressing the resources button on your screen. As I said earlier, we're also in the process of updating our How to Develop a Pretreatment Program guidance manual for POTWs, and we hope to have that available for you soon. So before we conclude this webcast, Al and Christine, do you have one message that you would like participants to remember specifically from this webcast?
Sure.
Al?
I'll go first. The industrial user inventory, it's a functional day-to-day tool for your program. It also has some benefits to your community, and the investment that you put into developing your inventory will pay off in the end. So don't think of that as just something to put together for the regulators. Think of it as a functional tool for your program. That's my message.
I guess my message is to piggyback on Al's, which seems normal since my presentation was to follow his. Yes, everyone who has an MPDS permit, all the POTWs, are required to regularly update their IU inventories. But it's not just a chore. It's to protect your plant. It's to protect your plant's enforcement status and also ultimately the environment. Oh, yeah, which is why a lot of us got into this business in the first place. So that's the take home.
Well,
thank you, everyone, for attending.
Yes, thanks.
Thank you, Al. Thank you, Christine, and thank you, Al. And for each of these Pretreatment 101 series webcasts, certificates will be available for each participant. A link to the certificate will appear on your screen. You can type each of the attendees' names in and print the certificates from your computers. Thank you again for joining us. This ends our first Pretreatment 101 series webcast. Thank you.